Hey everyone, it's Mostly Casual Commander. I'm BK. We're on Discord, Instagram, and Patreon, links in the description. In this Lord of the Rings game, Busterkins is piloting Tom Bombadil, basically Saga Tribal, looking to get all the value he can from sagas. J-Man is playing Shelob. He's looking to have his spider army deal damage to other creatures and make them into food, but they're copies. Scott is playing Lord of the Nazgul. This is a Wraith-focused deck that's going to cantrip a lot to make more Wraiths and beat up his opponents. And Kyle is playing his partner commanders, Frodo and Sam. This deck will have him gain a bunch of life, mostly by using food tokens, while his opponents get drained out. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and stick around for an appearance from my fat cat Meatball. He's so chunky. Busterkins kicked things off by playing Spara's Headquarters and passing to J-Man, who played a Forest as his land for turn before passing to Scott. He played Dark Slick Shores as his land and said go over to Kyle. He drops a Temple Garden, entering the battlefield untapped at the cost of 2 life, and he cast an Arbor Elf. He then says go, and on Busterkins' turn 2, he'll draw, and then he'll play Urza Saga as his land. And with that out on the battlefield, he'll cast an Arcane Signet before passing the turn back over to J-Man. He draws and plays Dark Boar Pathway as his land for turn. Then he'll pass back over to Scott, who draws and plays an island, and he also just says land go back over to Kyle. He plays Flooded Strand, and he cracks it, taking 1 life, and with that he'll grab an Overgrown Tomb, and also have that enter the battlefield untapped at the cost of 2 life before casting his commander Frodo, Adventurous Hobbit. And following that, he'll use his Arbor Elf to untap Temple Garden, and using that he'll cast Elves of Deep Shadow, which I 100% of the time want to say Elves of the Deep Shadow. Kyle passes back to Busterkins, and after he draws, Urza's Saga ticks up 1, and then he drops a Rogrin Triome as his land for turn. Then he'll activate Urza's Saga in order to make a Construct, aka Karnstruct. That thing gets bigger the more artifacts he has. He passes the turn over to J-Man, who plays a Forest, into a Talisman of Resilience. He's a bit slow to start, but he'll pass the turn over to Scott, who plays a Sunken Hollow. And Scott also is a bit slow to start, so he'll pass back to Kyle, who draws and plays a Brushland as his land for turn, before casting his other commander, Sam Loyal Attendant. This dude makes food whenever he moves into combat, and that food is cheaper. And so he does hop into combat, and Sam says potatoes before attacks are declared. Kyle will go ahead and activate his Arbor Elf, untapping a land, and using that land to sack the food, gaining 3 life. Kyle will declare his attacks with Frodo, and he'll trigger because he gained 3 life, so the ring tempts Kyle. And he'll choose Frodo to be his ring bearer, so now Frodo has Skulk, and Busterkins takes 1 point of damage from that commander. On Busterkins' turn, he draws, and then Urza's Saga triggers. In response to the trigger, he taps it for a colorless mana, and he got a Soul Ring from its ability. He plays Command Tower as his land for turn, then using that floating colorless, he casts Starfield Mystic, reducing the cost of his enchantments in the future. And then he drops Satyr Enchanter as well. Those 2 cards are going to be great in this deck. He drops Scholar of New Horizons as a follow-up play, so he could start messing with his counters on his sagas. He moves into combat with his Karnstruct at J-Man, who just takes his beats, and then Busterkins passes the turn. J-Man plays another Forest as his land and casts Twin Silk Spider. When this enters the battlefield, he's like, yo, get a 1/2 with reach as well, cause it's a twin. On Scott's turn, he plays Command Beacon, followed by a Wonder. And most of the time you want Wonder in your graveyard if you control an island, but it makes for a good block right now. On Kyle's turn, he moves right into combat, so Sam once again makes a food token, and before attacks are declared, Kyle sacks the food token using his Elves of Deep Shadow, so he pings himself for 1 but gains 3. Then when he attacks, the ring tempts him. Frodo says, yo, draw a card. On his second main phase, he casts Night's Whisper, drawing 2 cards and losing 2 life. Afterwards, he uses Arbor Elves to untap a land, and then he casts Trail of Crumbs. This will make him a food and could potentially get him some extra cards off the top of his library. Kyle then passes the turn over to Busterkins. On his turn 5, his first action will be to activate his Scholar of New Horizons, removing a counter from itself, and finding a Plains card. In this case, it was a Hallowed Fountain. He then casts Sterling Grove. This will trigger his Satyr Enchanter, drawing him a card. He follows that up by casting Inventive Iteration, again drawing a card when that spell is cast. Inventive Iteration bounces a creature back to its owner's hand, so J-Man loses that token because it dies. He then plays on his turn a Forest and casts his commander, Shelob, Child of Ungoliant, pronounced flawlessly. He passes the turn over to Scott, who plays a Malakir Mire as his land for turn, and again has to say go over to Kyle. On Kyle's turn, he cracks a food token, gaining 3 points of life, And because he sacked that food token, he can now pay for Trail of Crumbs. So he'll look at the top 2 cards of his library. He found an Isolated Chapel, and that'll go to his hand. Then Kyle moves into the red zone, so Sam will trigger, making him another food token. He has Frodo attack Busterkins, and he already gained 3 life this turn, so Frodo will trigger and draw him a card as well. He'll also loot before Busterkins takes his damage. Then, on his second main phase, Kyle casts Tireless Provisioner in that beautiful Lord of the Rings art. And with its landfall ability, Kyle will drop a command tower, triggering Tireless Provisioner and gaining a treasure token. Then, using said treasure, as well as his command tower, he casts Deadly Dispute. When he casts it, he sacrifices his food token to satisfy its additional cost. So he'll draw 2 cards, as well as make another treasure token. Following that, he'll sack the treasure token and cast a Gilded Goose. And when that enters the battlefield, he'll make another food token, before passing to Busterkins. He draws, puts his lore counter on his saga, and draws because of that, before dropping a Marsh Flats as his land for turn. He'll then crack the Marsh Flats, taking 1 life, and thanks to Marsh Flats, he'll drop a Swamp Drop. Then he'll cast his commander again, Tom Bombadil, and he keeps his fingers crossed that it'll stick around for a while this time. He follows that up by casting Jugan, Defends the Temple. When he casts that, he got a card draw, and when that lore counter is put on it, he'll get a Human Monk token, a mana dork. Afterwards, Busterkins moves into combat at Scott with his Construct, and Scott decides to block with Wonder, which makes total sense. On J-Man's turn, he main phases a Stew the Conies, having Shelob fight Tom Bombadil. Busterkins' Sadness hits the stack, and J-Man makes a copy of Tom Bombadil in the form of a food token. So the food says, I'm Tom. J-Man moves into combat at Kyle, and he just takes the beats, taking 8 commander damage. He drops a forest before passing the turn to Scott, who plays Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. So all the lands are swamps. He casts his commander, Lord of the Nazgul, and with that out, he's aiming at casting instants and sorceries to make wraiths. On Kyle's turn, he plays an Exotic Orchard, triggering his Tireless Provisioner, and he'll gain a treasure token because of that. Then he'll sack his food token, gaining 3 points of life, as well as moving into combat, making another food token, and declaring Frodo an attacker against Scott. This will trigger when he moves into combat, so he'll draw a card, loot a card, and of course the ring had tempted him. And after Frodo connects with Scott, each of Kyle's opponents will take 3 points of life as well. On his second main phase, Kyle plays probably one of the best cards in the set, Mirkwood Bats. So now when he makes tokens or sacks tokens, he'll drain his opponents. Then he follows that up by casting Disciple of the Vault. So whenever an artifact is put into the graveyard from anybody's board, Kyle can drain 1. Then he'll sacrifice his treasure, Mirkwood Bats will drain each one of his opponents 1 point of life, and Disciple of the Vault hits J-Man as well. Then he casts Pippin, Warden of Isengard. He decides not to go and try to find Merry with it, for reasons. It's cause Merry's in his hand. On Busterkin's turn, he puts his lore counters out after he draws, and then Living Breakthrough enters the battlefield, the flipped side of Inventive Iteration. His Jugan Saga put 1/1/1 counter on 2 things before he cast his commander for the 3rd time, Tom Bombadil. I'm sure he'll stick around this time, Busterkins. Then he casts Makiko's Reign of Truth. This triggers Satyr and Living Breakthrough, but in response, Scott casts an Offer You Can't Refuse, primarily to get a 3/3 off of his commander. And Reign of Truth is countered. Busterkins draws, and his opponents can't cast 2 drops. Now you may be noticing that I've used an overlay to represent Makiko's Reign of Truth. It turns out there was a placeholder card in its stead, so I have used the overlay to represent it, because otherwise it'd just be the back of a magic card with some words written on it. Our bad, this normally doesn't happen. Alright, back to it. Busterkins uses the 2 treasures he got from An Offer You Can't Refuse to cast Sithis Harvest's Hand. Kyle's Disciple of the Vault will drain him 2 in just a moment. He drew a card off of Satyr before hopping into combat with his Construct at Kyle, dropping him down to 30. On J-Man's turn, he plays Sky Fisher Spider. So when that enters the battlefield, he'll sacrifice his Twin Silk Spider in order to blow up, you guessed it, Tom Bombadil. Sorry, Busterkins. He moves to combat with Shelob at Kyle. Kyle declares blocks with his Gilded Goose, and before damage, he activates Gilded Goose, sacrificing a food, floating a mana, activating Trail of Crumbs, and remember that this triggered his drainers as well. He found a Lotho off the top of his library and puts it into his hand. Then Gilded Goose dies, and J-Man gets to make a copy of it that's a food, and when it enters the battlefield, it also makes a food. On Scott's turn, he casts Ring Sight. This will trigger his commander, getting him a 3/3. The ring tempts him, and he'll make his commander the Ring Bearer as well. Ring Sight lets him tutor a card. He decides to get Frantic Search out of his library, so he has a goal of getting as many wraiths out onto the battlefield as he can. So he casts that, triggering his commander, drawing 2 cards, discarding 2 cards, and untapping 3 lands, giving him the capability to cast another spell. But before using that mana, he'll just use 2 points of his life to satisfy Gitaxian Probe. So he'll look at Kyle's hand and draw a card, and this is after he makes yet another Wraith. So he casts Preordain as a follow-up play. Again, triggering his commander, getting a 3/3. He'll scry 2 and then draw 1 card. And quite frankly, I mean, all these cantrips are doing a wonderful job of making him Wraiths. He already has 5 of them on the board in this turn. He casts Distortion Strike, targeting his commander and triggering his commander, getting another 3/3. After that, he'll move into combat with his slightly buffed commander at Kyle in the air, dropping him to 25. Then he passes, and on Kyle's turn, he plays Isolated Chapel. This will trigger Tireless Provisioner, making a treasure token, and Mirkwood Bats drains everybody. He moves into combat, and Sam makes another food, and again, Mirkwood Bats drains his opponents. He cracks one of those food tokens. This triggers both Disciple and Mirkwood, gains him 3 life, and he moves into combat with Frodo at Scott. The ring tempts him, even though it's maxed out, so he'll draw off of Frodo, then he'll draw and discard a card because of the ability. He'll deal that point of damage to Scott, and because he did, he'll drain his opponent's 3. As a follow-up, he casts Mary, Warden of Isengard, aiming to pump out some 1/1s. He passes the turn to Busterkins, and after his draw step, Remnant of the Rising Star hits the battlefield on the flip side of Jugan. Then he drops Jetmir's Garden, followed by the Kami War. When that hit the stack, it triggered Satyr, Sithis, and Living Breakthrough. When that lore counter was put on it, he exiles Lord of the Nazgul. He draws his pair of cards, and then he casts Strionic Resonator, triggering Living Breakthrough again. Then he moves into the red zone, swinging at Kyle. Before blocks, Kyle activates Pippin, making a food token. Then Mary says, make a 1/1, and Mirkwood Bat sees both of those tokens being created, draining his opponent's 1 point for each. Then he uses the Soldier to block the Karnstruck, drops to 25 off of Living Breakthrough. On the end step, J-Man uses Gilded Food to make a food. On his turn, he plays Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth, making all the lands in play forests. He casts Arasta of the Endless Web, so he's hoping to make a bunch of 1/2s. He moves into combat with Shelob at Kyle once again, who takes his beats, dropping to 17. On Scott's turn, Distortion Strike is rebounded, targeting one of his Wraiths, and because he cast it, Arasta makes J-Man a 1/2 with reach. Then he plays an island, followed by Kindred Discovery. Then he holds back on defense, looking at all these scary board states. And then on Scott's end step, Kyle sacks a food, gaining 3 points of life, and Mirkwood Bats will drain each one of his opponents. Disciple of the Vault will target Scott, draining him 1. He was also able to activate Trail of Crumbs, finding a swamp and putting it into his hand. On his turn proper, he draws and plays his head swamp, triggering Tireless Provisioner as well as Mary, making 2 tokens, and Mirkwood Bats sees them both before casting Rapacious Guest. He moves into combat, triggering Sam, making a food token. This will trigger Mirkwood Bats, of course, draining his opponents. He sacks the food, triggering Mirkwood and Disciple. Then Rapacious Guest gets a +1/+1 counter on it, and he's able to activate Trail of Crumbs again, finding a Nadier's Nightblade, putting it into his hand. He declares his attackers with Frodo against Scott, so the ring will tempt him, and he'll draw a card, then he'll loot a card, and when he connects with Scott, each of his opponents will lose 3. He'll make a food token thanks to Rapacious Guest, then he'll cast Nadier's Nightblade. So he has yet another Tokens Matter synergy card, which is phenomenal. And we almost forgot that Mary made a 1/1 when he made that food token off of Rapacious Guest, so we resolve that now. Kyle passes the turn over to Busterkins. After he draws, he gets another lore counter on the Kami War, and he pays 2 to have Strionic Resonator copy that ability. He'll bounce one of Scott's Wraiths and make all of his opponents discard a card, and then he'll bounce Shelob back to J-Man's hand, again making all of his opponents discard a card. Following that, he casts Setsuki, the Living Lore, triggering Living Breakthrough and Remnant of the Rising Star. He sinks 3 mana into it, giving 3 counters to Setsuki. He moves into combat, swinging at J-Man and Kyle. J-Man decides to chump block Living Breakthrough with his 1/2 with reach. Busterkins passes, and on J-Man's turn, he recasts his commander, Shelob, Child of Ungoliant. J-Man moves into combat, swinging his 2 spiders at Kyle, and in response, before blocks, Kyle sinks his Elves of Deep Shadow into Pippin, making a food token, and Mary sees this and makes another 1/1. Both of those tokens are seen by Mirkwood Bats, draining his opponents. Kyle uses the 2 soldiers to chump block the spiders. They die, and Bats triggers yet again. On Scott's turn, he plays Creeping Tar Pit as his land for turn. He then sacrifices his command beacon. This allows him to bring Lord of the Nazgul back to his hand, which he can then cast, because now it doesn't cost too much. When he does, this triggers Kindred Discovery, drawing him a card. On Kyle's turn, he drops Marionette Master. This thing loves to see dying artifacts, especially when you fabricate 3 right on top of it, which he does. He moves into combat, making a food token because of Sam, as well as a soldier token. He attacks J-Man with Frodo. He didn't gain 3 life for this interaction, so he just loots because of the Ring Bearer. Then once he connects with J-Man, each of his opponents loses 3 life. And then, in his second main phase, all that Kyle has to do is crack open 2 of his treasures. This will trigger Marionette Master, Disciple of the Vault, as well as Mirkwood Bats, killing all of his opponents dead. Congratulations, Kyle. Job well done. And as promised, here's Meatball and his younger brother, Peanut. There you have it, that's the game. So what do you guys think of the new Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth set so far? Let us know in the comments, as well as what you thought about this game. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, thank you for watching.